Some of you may have been following the episode with Alex Jones, who's a provocateur of sorts, a conspiracy theorist of sorts, if you say so, who's active on a lot of different platforms, his own, but also platforms that are hosted by organizations like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, of course. And he was deplatformed by many, not all, apparently Twitter kept him on, but he was deplatformed by several of these big tech firms all at the same time, which in a sense sort of made it feel conspiratorial and just emboldened his fans to think that way. And I was reading some of the back and forth. There were some very trite things said about this. Well, it's free speech. Well, it's not free speech because they're private platforms, et cetera. There wasn't much interesting going on. But for those of you who consider yourselves conservatives, I would like to point out that David French at National Review is A-OK with what happened to Mr. Jones. So if any of you are National Review subscribers, I suggest you send him a nastygram. There's a lot of different words for this. I use the term PC. We can call it PC. We can call it neo-McCarthyism. We can call it cultural Marxism. And I know we all think of these terms as they're vague, they're loaded with context, they're not necessarily easily defined. Okay, now I'll grant you that. But so are lots of things that exist. The term society is vague and hard to define. Society exists. The term civilization is broad and vague and hard to define, but it still exists. So I think we can take a stab at defining what we'll call PC, but what is really this authoritarian imposition of thought control that I think is really gaining traction in the United States. And here's a definition, a working definition. It's a little lawyerly, so bear with me. Political correctness is the conscious, designed manipulation of language intended to change the way people speak, write, think, feel, and even act in furtherance of an agenda. So if we think about this in terms of manipulation, it feels very Soviet in a sense. It's a form of policing us, of policing our thoughts and words, and it takes many forms. But it always comes back to this idea that there is officially sanctioned thought. And if you're outside of it, maybe you're not a good person. So it's not just outright proposals for so-called hate speech laws, which are big throughout the West. America has been exempt so far, but don't kid yourselves. But there's lots of other ways that don't necessarily involve government, like deplatforming, like we saw this past week, or banning by social media companies. There's also shadow banning, which is where you're still permitted to have discourse on social media outlets, but no one can find you. Snitching on people, doxing them at their place of employment, mobbing people in restaurants and public spaces. We've seen that. That you might have heard the term called othering, which is an attempt to sort of portray people as beyond the pale. And in extreme cases, loss of one's job, one's career, maybe even one's friends or reputation based on wrong thought or wrong speak. So all of this is very sinister in my view, and in its attempt to silence those people whom the silencers believe are beyond the allowable range of public discourse. And what it's doing, of course, is it's creating the most invidious and dangerous form of censorship of all, which is self-censorship. And we all engage in it to an extent in our personal lives, let's be honest. So political correctness is not just a social issue like abortion, and it's not just part of the culture wars, it's actually an attempt to frame what we say about everything. So in that sense, PC is an overriding issue that affects all others. A couple of anecdotes that serve us today. Some of you might know the writer Kevin Williamson, who was a longtime writer for National Review and was recently given what is really a higher profile job writing for The Atlantic. The Atlantic magazine purports to be sort of an independent thought. It definitely skews left, but nonetheless, because he was identified as a conservative, a lot of Atlantic readers were aghast when this was announced, and they started digging into his old tweets, and it turns out he had some very incendiary tweets about abortion. He's apparently pro-lifer and made some joking or mocking references to applying the death penalty to women who go get an abortion. So this was considered an absolute outrage by folks on the left. And an online mob of sorts was formed And the Atlantic felt the heat and buckled to it and pulled the rug out from Mr. Williams, said, no, we've changed our minds. We're not going to have Mr. Williamson write at the Atlantic. Okay, fair enough. Atlantic's a private magazine. But you may have also heard about a woman named Sarah Jiang, I hope I'm saying that right, who was recently hired to the advisory board of the editorial component of the New York Times, the newspaper of record of sorts for the West, sad as that may be. She too had a lot of incendiary tweets in her background, some very silly stuff, but some very malicious and nasty stuff. And so in this instance, the right wing got active and busy on social media, going after her and blasting her. But the difference was, of course, that the New York Times said, no, we hear what you're saying, but we looked back at those tweets, we talked to her about it. She doesn't believe that stuff anymore, and we're going to have her at the New York Times. We're not going to let the mob win. And frankly, I don't care if Sarah Jiang is on the New York Times editorial board. I don't take New York Times editorials with any seriousness whatsoever. And so it's of no concern to me. And I'm kind of glad they stood up, to be frank. I think that this is a good thing. I would like to see more organizations doing that, saying, no, we're going to have her. And more importantly, to be fair, I think that some of the sentiments she voiced in those tweets are what a lot of folks on the left actually think. They might not just be so polite as to say them publicly. But here's the thing, is both Sarah Jiang and Kevin Williamson are going to be A-OK. They are mildly famous people with mildly successful careers who will go on to do other things in their lives if for some reason the New York Times, or in Kevin Williamson's case, the Atlantic, didn't work out. These are people with some, probably a little bit of money and some name ID and some opportunities out there in the world. But not everybody is like that. So I'd like to bring up an anecdote that has a little different ending, particularly with respect to a couple of friends of mine. One of them's name is Daniel McAdams. He heads up the Ron Paul Institute in Texas, which is a very anti-interventionist, anti-war small group. And Scott Horton. Scott Horton is also a libertarian activist, very anti-war, and wrote a book called Fool's Errand, which really documents what I agree with, some of you may not, foolishness in terms of our never-ending longest war in human history, in U.S. history, in Afghanistan. A war on which we spent trillions of dollars. So anyway, both of these gentlemen got kicked off Twitter earlier this week. They were involved in a spat with another Twitterer and saying some things back and forth, and they defended a guy who was saying something like, I hope the Trump zombies come eat you, or something like that. And so somebody got upset and said, well, this violates Twitter's terms of service. You ought to ban these guys because they're threatening violence. No one was threatening violence. But nonetheless, they were both kicked off Twitter. And for people who really operate on very little money, people who operate at the margins of public discourse, a platform like Twitter is very valuable, very, very valuable to them. And it's no longer available. So, the state didn't come along and say, Scott Horton and Daniel McAdams, you can't say that. If you continue to say that, we're going to fine you. Uncle Sam is going to fine you, or your state or county is going to fine you. The government didn't come along and say, we're going to put you in jail if you don't stop yammering about the war in Afghanistan. None of that happened. But in a sense, their lives and the lives of some other people who have been attacked on social media actually did get smaller. If we think about it, when someone goes to jail, they're literally in a cage, and they can't have any contact with their friends and family, they can't work, etc. So we've really contained their life and made it smaller. But to a lesser extent, we're kind of doing that with these social media outrage mobs. We're not putting people in jail, but we might be diminishing their lives, making their lives smaller in terms of their career opportunities, the money they might make, their circle of friends, their circle of influence. These things shrink. So they're not in jail, but they did get smaller. So there's certainly a punishment element to it. And frankly, when I look at the Mises Institute, which is considered a pretty, in the world of economics, it's considered a radical organization, it would not take much for someone like Google to come along and say, we're going to erase the Mises Institute from our search results. So unless you're using DuckDuckGo or one of the other browsers, you're not even going to find them. Or we're just going to disappear their search results to page 20 because we don't like the Mises Institute anymore. A lot of our web traffic comes from Google searches, probably about 50, 60%. That would dramatically affect our ability to get our message out if Google ever decided to do that. Our reach would get smaller. So here's the conundrum, at least for me, is that I'm one of those deadly boring doctrinaire libertarians. You know, as far as I'm concerned, we could probably get by without government roads. We could probably get by without government courts, police, etc. I'm a doctrinaire, dyed-in-the-wool libertarian. I don't really believe in the concept of public goods. I'm just being open with you. I don't think we need to apply public utilities regulation or common carrier regulation or whatever to social media. And really, what's happening in the last few years has forced me to challenge my own views on this. I'm a little struggling with it because 5 or 10 years ago I would have said, oh come on, the lowest level DMV clerk or traffic cop has more power over your life than Google. They can come along and ruin your day, not give you the sticker for your car, or whatever, deny you or give you a traffic ticket. And Google, your relationship with Google is entirely voluntary, just like it is with the Catholic Church or something, whereas the IRS, your relationship with the IRS is involuntary. So that's the difference between Google and the state. And that's fair enough, and that fits a lot of neat little boxes for me and for a lot of people conceptually. But social media is where the conversation takes place today. Kicking someone off social media is almost like kicking them out of, let's say, the Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park in London, where you go stand on a box. The Hyde Park is a public park. I don't know if it's City of London or City of Westminster, but it's a public park. So people would say, well, Jeff, that's a public park and Google's private. But nonetheless, Hyde Park is where you go stand on a soapbox, or at least you used to before the internet, to make your point in London. Social media is the place where a lot of people go to make their point today. People who don't have a room like this or a microphone or a beautiful luncheon. Maybe they're at home. Maybe they're poor. Maybe they're handicapped. Maybe they can't go out. Maybe Twitter's quite a lifeline to them. So the short answer is, well, go build your own social media platforms that don't kick libertarians or Mises.org or Scott Horton off of them, and go after the advertisers of people at places like Facebook and Twitter that do kick you off. Okay, and I accept that answer to an extent. But what happens when these companies, these tech and social media companies, are so heavily involved with government? What happens when they work with the government at all levels? They are involved in data collection and spying and developing weapons, in many cases, AI, artificial intelligence. Some of the big companies like Amazon provide cloud services to all kinds of federal agencies. So these tech companies derive a lot of their social and economic and even cultural power, not just from their competence in the marketplace. And I would say Facebook is pretty competent in social media, but increasingly from their connections to government as well, or at least the threat of their connections to government. What if there is, in fact, sort of what we might call a media industrial complex, just like we use the term warfare industrial complex. What if there's a media industrial complex? And what if it really does create sort of an undeserving tech power elite? People who would not have the power and pull they have if it wasn't for this melding of corporate and state power. So at what point are, what I assume all of us as civil libertarians, at what point are we justified in beginning to oppose these powerful tech companies and media companies when they blur the distinction between outright First Amendment violations by an expressly government actor and then the quasi-private silencing of alternative voices like Alex Jones by state-connected actors? At some point, there's a little bit of a fine line there.